a rising and not setting sun. Dr. Franklin, looking toward the president's chair, at the back of which a rising sun happened to be painted, observed to, to a few new to a few members near him. The painter had found it difficult to distinguish in their art a rising from a setting sun. I have said he often and often in the course of seasons and the vicissitudes of my hopes and fears as to its issue, looking at that behind the president without being able to tell whether it is a rising or setting. But now at length I have this happiness to know that it is a rising and not a setting sun. James Madison, Debates in the Federal Convention of 1787, Notes on the last day of the convention, September 17th, 1787. The gathering of men that crafted our federal constitution was a remarkable collection of talent, accomplishment, and political leadership. Thomas Jefferson praised them as a remarkable group of men. In all, the 12 state legislature, Rhode Island did not participate, chose 73 men to be delegates, but only 55 attended some part of the deliberation. At the close of their efforts, 39 signed the finished Constitution. Most of the delegates were wealthy lawyers, planters, merchants, and the like, and many were well educated. 7 had served as state governors, 8 had signed the Declaration of Independence 11 years earlier, and 21 had fought in the War for Independence. Their average age was 42. The work of the work of crafting a revision to the Articles of Confederation did not go easily. When the convention opened on May 14, 1787, not enough states were represented for the convention to begin its work. It took until May 25th. The delegates agreed to keep their deliberations secret, which meant that they worked in closed rooms through the hot Philadelphia summer. The men even had conflicts over their basic purpose. They agreed that the Articles of Confederation needed revision, but some wanted as few revisions as possible, while others desired to scrap the article and write an entirely new document. The decision to go forth with a new document pleased most of the delegates, but not all of them. At one point, 2 of the 3 delegates from New York went home in frustration. The third, Alexander Hamilton, had to go home also, even though he approved of the plan. Hamilton later returned and signed the finished Constitution. Because the delegates to the convention agreed to work in secret, they kept no record of the proceedings except James Madison's shorthand notes. Madison transcribed his notes in the evening, except for scattered comments by delegates in letters and other writings. Madison's notes are our only record of what happened in the convention. To promote unity in the new nation and to protect the reputations of the participants, Madison prevented the publication of his notes until the death of the last delegate, which turned out to be Madison himself in 1836. The delegates to the convention had not accomplished all they had in their lives by being passive and silent. The group included many strong personalities, and as a result, the debates were often lively and sometimes heated. James Madison was a brilliant, scholarly, and eager 36-year-old. Benjamin Franklin was 81 and contributed little except his wisdom and widely respected presence. George Mason of Virginia was suspicious of all governmental power. Eldridge Geer of Massachusetts found fault with just about every idea that other delegates put forth. Mason and Geary refused to sign the Constitution when the delegates finished their deliberations. War hero George Washington was chairman. His presence gave legitimacy to the proceedings, but he participated little in the discussions. Two leading minds of the Revolution were not present. John Adams was serving as the new nation's minister to Great Britain, and Thomas Jefferson was in the same role in France. Because of their sharply differing points of view, the delegates found that they had to craft a series of compromises to make any progress. Despite these compromises, several delegates and a significant portion of state leaders and the general population had serious reservations about the document. The larger states had the most people and the biggest economics, and they wanted to have the most power in the new government. Smaller states feared that they would become irrelevant if the larger states had most of the power under the new Constitution. Smaller states generally preferred the system under the Articles that gave each state one vote in Congress. The Virginia delegates put forth a proposal that called the representation in a lower house of the Congress based on the state's population, with an upper house chosen by the lower house from nominees submitted by state legislatures. In response, the New Jersey delegates wanted to retain equal representation for the states in a unicameral one-house legislature. Roger Sherman of Connecticut suggested the compromise that resolved this difference. He proposed that the lower house, the House of Representatives, be based on population. This pleased the large states. Meanwhile, each state would have two senators in the Senate, the upper house, and the state legislation would choose the senators from their representative states. The senator would vote as individuals, but each state would have the same power in the Senate. This pleased the smaller states. The arrangement of the Senate reflected the importance that state government had at the time. The state legislature had named representatives to the Continental Congress, to Congress under the Articles, and to the Constitutional Convention. Now they would name the members of one of the two bodies of Congress. This provision was an attempt at fairness, and it was also an attempt to win the support of state government leaders for the new Constitution, even though the state legislature would not vote on the document. Many state political leaders served in both the state legislature and in the state ratifying convention. The discussion of a national executive also caused sharp debate. The desire for the executive to have a significant power was a major departure from state practices with their governors and from the experience under the Articles where there was no executive that the people elected. Some delegates feared the power that an individual person might acquire, while others thought that an executive would help bring about a more effective government and better relations with other countries. The compromise regarding the office of president involved strictly enumerating and limiting his powers, allowing Congress to override his veto and making him subject to impeachment and removal of office. A few delegates wanted the country's voters to elect the president, but the majority of delegates were not ready for that. James Wilson of Pennsylvania proposed a system of presidential electors, which has come to be called the Electoral College, to select the president. Electors would be chosen by states in a manner that each state legislature decided. The purpose of the Electoral College was for a few leading men to choose the president. However, over time, state legislatures decided to choose electors by popular vote, and the electors almost always voted for the candidate endorsed by their political party. Thus, the Electoral College became a semi-democratic method of choosing the chief executive. Opinions of the delegates differed on slavery, though not as sharply as opinions differed 75 years later. Slavery, slavery, slavery was concentrated into southern states. Although some northern delegates considered slavery a moral evil, they generally agreed that slavery was an issue for the state, not the national government, to address. This This perspective allowed the Constitutional Convention and Congress to avoid dealing with a potentially explosive subject. Slave state delegates wanted to count slaves as part of the population that determined representation in the House, even though no state gave slaves the right to vote for those representatives. Northerners thought that this position was hypocritical and insisted that the census include slaves to determine the direct taxes the Congress could impose on the state. A direct tax was revenue that Congress requested from the states based on population. Since slaves helped produce a state's wealth, Northerners thought that the census should include slaves to determine what a state owed to the federal government. Slave state delegates resisted this idea, hoping that they could lessen the burden of federal taxes on their states as a result. The compromise that the convention reached called for three-fifths, or 60% of the slave population to be counted for both representation and taxation. Another issue involved whether Americans could continue to import slaves. Slave state delegates wanted to be able to continue importing slaves, while other delegates wanted to stop the inhumane practice nationwide. Some state governments had already outlawed importing slaves. The compromise that the delegates reached called for the slave trade to end no sooner than 1808, 20 years after the expected adoption of the Constitution. Congress reserved the right to tax all slaves that were imported until the slave trade ended. The U.S. government did, in fact, end the importation of slaves with a law that went into effect in 1808. The compromise that the delegates reached on the issue of slavery show how compromise does not really satisfy the parties involved. The convention delegates' compromises regarding slavery did not resolve the issue. They only kicked the problem down the road for later leaders to address. The fact that the framers of the Constitution did not use the word slavery demonstrates the sensitivity many felt about the subject. The document merely refers to free persons and other persons. Supporters of slavery thought that the provision in the Constitution went too far, while opponents of slavery thought the final document did not go far enough. The Constitution did not include the word slavery until the passage of the 13th Amendment in 1865, which outlawed slavery. The main question delegates had to decide was how strong the central government should be. Most Americans agreed that it ought to be strong enough to do what it needed to do, but not so strong that it threatened the rights and freedoms of the states and of individual Americans. Where the precise balance lay was the subject of debate. Many Americans feared a strong central government because of their experience as colonies of Great Britain. They wanted more political power to remain with the states. However, others, focused on the weaknesses of the Confederation system, as outlined in the previous lesson, and argued for stronger powers for the central government. Both sides wanted an effective system of government that avoided tyranny and domination by a few, but they differed on the best way to accomplish this goal. The outcome of the convention addressed the issue in several ways. The Constitution gave only specific, enumerated, delegated powers to the national government. The Constitution was not an open invitation for the federal government to take over and do whatever Congress or the President wanted. The federal government was not to go beyond and enumerated powers, and the states retained all powers that the Constitution did not expressly give to the federal government. A key word in understanding American government is federalism. This word describes a form of government which has divided sovereignty but is unified in its purpose. In the United States, the national government is sovereign in some areas of the governmental activity, while the government of the 50 individual states are sovereign in other areas. Within the operation of the federal government, the Constitution called for a separation of power among three branches of government: legislative, executive, and judicial, and for checks and balances among the branches to keep one branch from dominating the government. One example of the separation of power is that the president is commander in chief of the armed forces, but only Congress has the power to declare war. The separation of power has often been described in this way: the legislature makes laws, the executive the executive carries out laws, and the judiciary applies and interprets laws. However, the federal government has not always maintained this ideal distinction. For instance, executive orders by the president, administrative rules by government agencies, and rulings by the U.S. Supreme Court are not laws Congress has passed, but all carry the force of law in practice. The following example illustrates the system of checks and balances that the three federal branches have on each other. The President negotiates treaties and makes appointments, but the Senate has to approve them before they go into effect. Congress passes law, but the President can veto these laws, but then Congress can override the veto. The Supreme Court interprets laws, but the President nominates people to serve on the court, and the Senate must approve these nominations. The people and the Electoral College choose the president, and federal judges can hold office for life. But Congress has the power to impeach and remove from office the president, the vice president, federal judges, and also officers of the United States government. The result of the Constitutional Convention's deliberations was a national government that was strong, that was stronger than what it had been under the Article of Confederation, but not so strong that state governments withered into insignificance or the individuals feared for their personal or political liberties. The framers of the Constitution decided that approval by conventions in 9 of the 13 states would be sufficient for the new government to take effect. This decision addressed two significant issues. First, approval did not have to be unanimous, which eliminated a weakness of the Articles of Confederation. Second, the ratification vote would take place in conventions, not state legislatures. The delegates feared that the legislature might resist what they saw as giving up a degree of their power to the proposed federal government. So the Constitution called for the convention that the people chose directly. The farmers hoped that a majority of voters would see the need for the Constitution and support its adoption. The framers hoped that a majority of the voters would see the need for the Constitution and support its adoption. The convention submitted its work to the states on September 28, 1787. The approval of at least 9 states was not a foregone conclusion. Those favoring adoption, called Nationalists or Federalists, were better organized and communicated their vision of the government well. Their outstanding effort was a series of newspaper articles published in New York and circulated to other states. The 85 articles, all signed "Publice" or "Public Man," were actually written vicariously by James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay. The thoughtful and literary articles presented the author's appeal for a strong national government and tried to calm the fears of those suspicious of the proposed Constitution. Printers eventually collected these articles and published them as the Federalist or the Federalist Papers. Opponents generally carried the label of anti-federalist. In speeches, articles, and state conventions, they warned of what they saw as the dangers of the proposed change. Sam Adams of Massachusetts and Patrick Henry of Virginia are the best known opponents of ratification. The ratification process moved slowly, extending into the summer of 1788. The conventions of only three states, Delaware, New Jersey, and Georgia, ratified the Constitution unanimously. The Ninth State Convention, that of New Hampshire, gave its approval by 57 to 46 votes on June 21st, 1788. However, the New York and the Virginia Convention still had not taken a vote, and most people saw their approval as vital to the Constitution's success. The Virginia Convention approved 87 to 78 later in June, and New York assented 30 to 27 in July. The process for creating the new government began. State held elections, and the first Congress met in March of 1789. However, another month passed before a quorum of members of Congress arrived in New York. The first national capital, with congressional approval of the Electoral College, George Washington took the oath of office as the first president. Then the North Carolina Ratifying Convention approved the Constitution 194 to 77 in November of 1789. And finally, Defiant Rhode Island, which is critic which its critics dubbed Rogue Island, gave its approval in the closest ratification vote of any Senate, 34 to 32, in late May of 1970. Late, wait a minute, in late May of 1790. Despite strong opposition and several close convention votes, the Constitution went into effect without further serious opposition. The Constitution was a product of its time. It was a response to the Americans' experience and as colonies of Great Britain and to their knowledge of British and world history. It also reflected the Enlightenment view that reasonable men could peaceably form a government that operated responsibly and that respected the rights of individuals. It was not only it was not a truly democratic document because the framers mistrusted democracy, which many called mob rule. The Constitution accepted the practice of slavery and did not provide for women and non-whites in the political process. Yet the Constitution has lasted well beyond its own time and has guided our country admirably for over 200 years. It has served as a model for constitutions in many other countries. The Constitution has been successful for a number of reasons. First, the framers tried to look past their own personal and contemporary interests to create a document that would continue to work even in changing circumstances. Second, they tried to make the will of the people, as best they could understand it, paramount and to limit the powers of government. Third, the framers based the Constitution on ideals of fairness and equality under the law. They did not single out one group or class of privileged. Fourth, the document has a flexibility that has allowed later Americans to amend it when needed. Perhaps most importantly, the American people have not wanted to change their basic form of government. Small movements for succession arose in New England during the War of 1812 and again during the Mexican War, but little came of them. The country did suffer a major division with the succession of Southern states in 1860, 1861, and the resultant Civil War. The horrors of that period has all but completely eliminated revolutions and rebellions as viable options in the American political system. Our differences have been many, and sometimes deep, and our failings have been serious, but most people, most of the time, have been willing to play by the rules set forth in the United States Constitution. A popular story says that when the convention adjourned and Benjamin Franklin walked out into the streets, a woman asked him what kind of government they had devised. A republic, madam, if we can keep it, was supposedly his reply. Many people in that day feared the danger of tyranny by a single leader or a small group. The amazing story of America is that we have indeed kept our republic by our commitment to the principles embodied in the Constitution. By the grace of God, we will keep it as long as we obey Jesus' command. In everything, therefore, treat people the same way you want them to treat you. For this is the law and the prophets. Matthew 7:12. The Federalist number 2. John Jay. This essay concerning dangers from foreign force and influence was published on October 31st, 1787. To the people of the state of New York. When the people of America reflect that they are now called upon to decide a question which, in its consequences, must prove one of the most important that ever engaged their attention, the propriety of their taking a very comprehensive as well as very serious view of it will be evident. Nothing is more certain than the indispensable necessity of government, and it is equally undeniable that whenever and however it is instituted, the people must cede to it some of their natural rights in order to vest it with requested power. It is well worth a consideration, therefore, whether it be conduce more to the interest of the people of America that they should, to all general purpose, be one nation under one federal government, for that they should divide themselves into separate confederations and give to the head of each the same kind of power which they are advised to place in one national government. It has until lately been a received and uncontradicted opinion that the prosperity of the people of America depended on their continuing firmly united, and the wishes and prayers and efforts of our best and wisest citizens have been constantly directed to that objective. But politicians now appear to insist that this opinion is erroneous, and that instead of looking for safety and happiness in union, we ought to seek it in a division of the states into district confederacies and sovereignties. However extraordinary this new doctrine may appear, it nevertheless has its advocates and certain characters who were much opposed to it formerly are at present of the number, whatever may be the argument and inducement which have wrought this change in the sentiment and declarations of these gentlemen, it certainly would not be wise in the people at large to adopt these new political tenets without being fully convinced that they are founded in truth and a sound policy. It has often given me pleasure to observe that independent America was not composed of detached and distant territories, but that one connected, fertile, widespread country was the portion of our Western sons of liberty. Providence has in a particular manner blessed it with a variety of soils and productions, and watered it with innumerable streams for the delight and accommodations of its inhabitants. A succession of navigable waters forms a kind of chain around its borders as if to bind it together, while the most noble rivers in the world running at convenient distances, present them with highways for the easy communication of friendly aids and the mutual transportation and exchange of various commodities. With equal pleasure, I have as often taken notice that Providence has been pleased to give this one connected country to one united people, a people descended from the same ancestors, speaking the same language, professing the same religion, attached to the same principles of government, very similar in their manners and customs, and who, by their joint counsel, arms, and efforts, fighting side by side throughout a long and bloody war, have established have nobly established general liberty and independence. This country and this people seem to have been made for each other, and it appears as if it was the design of Providence that inheritance so proper and convenient for a band of brethren united to each other by the strongest ties should never be split into a number of unsocial, jealous, and alien sovereignties. Similar sentiments have hitherto prevailed among all others and all orders and denominations of men among us. To all general purposes we have uniformly been one people, each individual citizens everywhere enjoying the same national rights, privileges, and protection. As a nation, we have made peace and war. As a nation, we have vanquished our common enemies. As a nation, we have formed alliances and made treaties and entered into various compacts and conventions with foreign states. A strong sense of value and blessings of union induced the people at a very early period to institute a federal government to preserve the and perpetuate it. They formed it almost as soon as they had a political existence, nay, at a time when their inhabitants at a time when their habitations were in flames, when many of their citizens were bleeding, and when the progress of hostility and desolation left little room for those calm and mature inquiries and reflections which must ever precede the formation of a wise and well balanced government for a free people. It is not to be wondered at that a government instituted in times so inauspicious should an experiment be found greatly deficient and inadequate to the purpose it was intended to answer. This intelligent people perceived and regretted their defects, still continuing no less attached to union than enamored enamored of liberty. They observed the danger which immediately threatened the former and more remotely the latter, and being persuaded that ample security for both could only be found in a national government more wisely framed, they, as with one voice, convened the late convention of Philadelphia to take the important subject under consideration. This convention, composed of men who possessed the confidence of the people, and many of whom had become highly distinguished by their patriotism, virtue, and wisdom, in times which tried the minds and hearts of men, understood the arduous task. In the middle season of peace, with minds unoccupied by other subjects, have passed many months to cool, uninterrupted, and daily consultation, and finally, without having been awed by power or influenced by many possessions except love for their country, they presented and recommended to the people the plan produced by their joint and very unanimous council. Admit, for so is the fact, that this plan is only recommended, not imposed, yet let it be remembered that it is neither recommended to blind approbations nor to blind reprobation, but to the sedate and candid consideration which the magnitude and importance of the subject demand, and which it certainly ought to receive. But this As remarked in the foregoing number of these papers, it is more to be wished than expected that it may be so considered and examined. Experience on a former occasion teaches us not to be too sanguine in such hopes. It is not yet forgotten that well-grounded apprehensions of imminent danger induced the people of America to form the memorable Congress of 1774. That body recommended certain measures to their constituents, and the event proved their wisdom. Yet it is fresh in our memory how soon the press began to teem with pamphlets and weekly papers against those very measures. Not only many of the officers of government who obeyed the dictates of personal interest, but others from a mistaken estimate of consequences, or the undue influence of former attachments, or those ambition aimed at objects which did not correspond with the public good, were indefatigable in their efforts to persuade the people to reject the advice of their patriots. Congress. Many, indeed, were deceived and deluded, but the great majority of the people reasoned and decided judiciously, and happy they are in reflecting that they did so. They considered that the Congress was composed of many wise and experienced men, that being convened from different parts of the country, they brought with them the communicated to each other a variety of useful information. That is, in the course of time they passed together in inquiring into and discussing the true interests of their country, they must have acquired very accurate knowledge on their head that they were individually interested in the public liberty and prosperity, and therefore that it was not less their inclination than their duty to recommend only such measures as after the most mature deliberation they really thought prudent and advisable. Those and similar considerations then induced the people to rely greatly on the judgment and integrity of the Congress, and they took their advice, notwithstanding various arts and endeavors used to deter them from it. But if the people at large had reason to confide in the men of that Congress, few of whom had been fully tried or generally known, still greater reason have they now to respect the judgment and advice of the convention, for it is well known that some of the most distinguished members of that Congress, who have been since tried and justly approved for patriotism and abilities, and who have grown old in acquiring political information, were also members of the convention, and carried into it the accumulated knowledge and experience. It is worthy of remark that not only the first but every succeeding Congress, as well as the late convention, have invariably joined with the people in thinking that the prosperity of America depends on its union. To preserve and perpetuate it was the great object of the people in forming that convention, and it is also the great object of the plan which the convention has advised them to adopt. With what propriety, therefore, or for what good purpose, are attempts at this particular period made by some men to deprecate the importance of the Union? Or why is it suggested that three or four confederacies would be better than one? I am persuaded in my own mind that people have always thought right on this subject, and that their universal and uniform attachment to the cause of the Union rests on great and weighty reasons, which I shall endeavor to develop and explain in some ensuing papers. They who promote the idea of substituting a number of distinct confederations in the room of the plan of the convention seem clearly to foresee that the rejection of it would put the continuance of the Union in the utmost jeopardy. They certainly would be the case. That certainly would be the case, and I sincerely earnestly wish that it may be a clear, as clearly foreseen by every good citizen, that whenever the dissolution of the Union arrives, America will have reason to explain, in the words of the poet, farewell, a long farewell to my all greatness.